Matthew 11:28 through 30. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. It was supposed to be just a fun social experiment. That is, the illustration I used in my first sermon of the year 2020 with the high school students that I was pastoring at the time. No one knew a pandemic was on the horizon, that life as we knew it would forever change, or that our globalized world would suddenly shrink to the screens around us, peddled as the primary outlet to keep us both connected and safe. And so it was supposed to be just a fun social experiment. That night, I would ask hundreds of high school students to stand up. I then asked for everyone to pull out their smartphones, which probably 95% of the room had, and I helped them navigate to the worst, best invention Apple has ever created, the Screen Time app. As soon as I asked our students to do this, there was a collective groan across the room. Our students knew where I was going with this. I said, hey, stay standing if you've been on your phone for 30 minutes today. Not one person sat down. Stay standing if you've had an hour of screen time, 2 hours, 3 hours. At this point, I sat down. Even though I knew this experiment was coming, I still had racked up 2 hours and 45 minutes of screen time usage that day. And I remember thinking, how in the world could my phone be needed for upwards of 3 hours on a daily basis? This self-reflection certainly bruised my ego, but I felt it necessary to ask that question. Unfortunately, the most grievous revelation of the night was still to come, so I continued. Stay standing if you've had 4 hours of screen time. 5 hours. Well over 100 kids were still standing. Eventually, it came down to 2 students who had each spent 8 hours on their phones that day. A full-time job staring at their screens. This isn't how it's supposed to be, I remember thinking. And so after the gathering, I pulled aside one of those final 2 students standing whom I'd developed a good enough relationship with to ask not so much confrontationally, but curiously, hey, what have you been doing on your phone for 8 hours today? Her answer sounded a bit foreign then, but probably won't cause anyone to bat an eye now. Oh, I'm an Instagram influencer, and I need to be on there constantly so I'm accessible to my followers. I see. Well, what happens if you're, not available? Then I'm ruined. I'll lose all of the influence I've gained. And I remember not really being sure how to respond to that, and so I turned the conversation and went about the rest of the night, but to this day, I haven't been able to shake those words. What was intended to be a fun social experiment ended up becoming a revealing window into just how deeply embedded this belief is in our culture, that our value rises with our connectivity. That our constant availability is the currency and cost of influence. And it seems like that cost is starting to raise some alarm bells well beyond the walls of a high school church gathering in suburban Indianapolis. 4 years later, in June of 2024, the then U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, called for placing a warning label on social media platforms, saying, quote, "The mental health crisis among young people is an emergency. And social media has emerged as an important contributor. Adolescents who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of anxiety and depression symptoms, and the average daily use in this age group as of summer of 2023 was 4.8 hours. Additionally, nearly half of adolescents say social media makes them feel worse about their bodies." And so what was supposed to be a fun social experiment was actually a wake-up call to a haunting reality, a reality that isn't going away anytime soon. The comatose state of mind has now even been historically preserved as the Oxford Dictionary declared its word of the year in 2024 to be brain rot. Brain rot is marked by a supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as a result of overconsumption of material, now particularly online content, considered to be trivial or unchallenging. And now, with the introduction of artificial intelligence, we're seeing only a heightening of this dislocation between what is real and what is not. Popular Gen Z author Freya India, in her reflection on our current reality, writes, quote, "Now we are raising children in imaginary worlds and at the same time killing their imagination. That's the real cruelty about this. Kids today have their imaginary worlds generated for them. Instead of writing their own stories, they can put prompts into ChatGPT. Instead of creating their own fantasy worlds, they can generate them with just a few clicks." It seems that we are more connected than ever before, and yet have never felt more alone. I also think it's safe to say that we are, by and large, addicted to our screens. I mean, outside of sleep, meals, and work, the essentials, can you think of anything else that you do for 3 hours compulsively every single day? Many of us have just come to accept a background hum of low-grade anxiety that permeates our daily lives. We assume that this is just how it's supposed to be. But is it? Be honest, aside from the low hum of anxiety within, there's also this faint form of discontent, isn't there? We scroll, and yet that void remains. We've gained access to seemingly everything, and yet we feel anchored to virtually nothing. You feel this, don't you? As the Catholic theologian Ron Rolheiser says, quote, "We are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion." But what if this isn't how human beings were meant to live? What if the soul wasn't designed for endless pings, demands, and digital slop? And what if that unease that we're actually feeling is a prophetic pull to call us back to a slower, saner, more sacred way of life? Family, what if Jesus is inviting you and I today into a better, truer way of being human? Really? I mean, Micah, is it that deep? Is this conversation of screen time really existential? I would wholeheartedly argue yes. I would argue that things like these are the defining idol of our generation that we are going to have to surrender to Jesus. Now, a caveat, what I'm not saying is that screen time or technology is inherently evil. The invitation today will not be to become a Luddite, to throw away all of your devices and to step completely off the grid, though I'm sure on some days, like me, you want to. No, in fact, technology has brought us some beautiful advancements, including, but not limited to, relational connections like FaceTime, phone calls, and texting. We've seen romantic relationships, even here in our church community, begin online and become flourishing marriages. We have exercise, nutrition, and sleep apps that help us remain active and healthy. We have the ability to access information like books, research papers, and articles that stimulate our thinking at the touch of a button. We can read the scriptures and study the Bible with friends in all kinds of different places and in all kinds of different creative ways. All of these are good and beautiful enhancements that have come as a result of technology in our lives. And so, again, I'm not saying that screen time or technology is inherently evil. I am saying that there are evil forces and actors at play who are attempting to use these devices to malform and even harm us. Bill Maher, in a famous 2012 monologue, played 2 clips of 2 whistleblowers from 2 different companies. One was from a big tobacco company who admitted to the world that companies were engineering cigarettes to be more addictive. The other was from Google, who essentially said the same thing. The difference, however, Maher notes, is that, quote, "Big tobacco just wanted your lungs. The App Store wants your soul." Today, we are continuing in a series of teachings that we began last week on the biblical practice of simplicity. And that extends to our screens as well. For many of us, these devices were not so much chosen as given. We've grown up with them since before we could walk. They've become so etched into our lives, so a part of the everyday fabric of our existence that I wonder if we've ever stopped to ask why. Or perhaps the better question may be, how? How is technology enhancing or hurting my apprenticeship to Jesus? How are my devices shaping what I pay attention to and what I ignore? And what does that reveal to me about my desires? How is the pace of my digital life forming the pace of my actual life? How often is technology pulling me out of being present and attuned to God and to others? How are traps of comparison wedging themselves into my spirit through what I consume online? How is the constant flow of information shaping my imagination and my prayer life? And how are my devices discipling me? And do I even like who I'm becoming because of it? And listen, maybe you're here and you're not like my high school students who were and are spending hours upon hours per day on their devices. But if you have a smartphone or a flip phone, sit in front of a laptop or a desktop, or are simply a part of the 97% of Americans who have at least one TV in their home nowadays, then I think it's important to note that until we get under the hood of questions like these, in our relationship to the screens in our lives, maturity into the image of Jesus is going to be dramatically delayed. And this is where the beauty of the practice of simplicity comes in. Today, I want to introduce you, or perhaps reintroduce you to the way, the truth, and the life that is Jesus of Nazareth. And I want to explore how his way, his truth, and his life provide for us a roadmap to navigate the complex, connected, technological world that is our current cultural moment. So we're going to take them one at a time today. Truth, life, and way. First, truth. For those of us who have been following Jesus for any length of time, we are probably aware that nowhere in the scriptures do we find Jesus disowning or disavowing devices, technology, or screens. In fact, all of those things were still roughly 1,800 years away from even being culturally relevant to Jesus. But it is fun to think of some hypotheticals, like, would Jesus own an iPhone if he were living in flesh today? I could tell you he definitely wouldn't own an Android. Shots fired. Or how many Instagram followers do you think Jesus would have? What would Jesus' favorite TikTok dance be? Okay, I'll stop before it gets too weird. Hopefully you get the point. It's fun trying to think about what Jesus would be like had he been born, raised, and began his ministry on earth today rather than 2,000 years ago. But alas, such questions cannot be answered. However, I do believe that there's insight to be gleaned from the scriptures regarding how Jesus would live if he were coming of age today. My take? He'd be the same now as he was then. Seriously, if Jesus was walking around today, I can say with certainty that he'd be kind, patient, gentle, warm, loving, caring, selfless, and sacrificial. And so the question beneath the question isn't, would Jesus have devices or social media if he was walking around today? The question beneath the question is, how do we become more like Jesus? How do we become people who mirror that very character? People who are also kind and patient, gentle, warm, loving, caring, selfless, and sacrificial. Well, we begin with the truth of what Jesus said. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. He calls us children of God and inheritors of his kingdom. In John's gospel, Jesus says that we are sheep and he is the good shepherd, and that we are not of this world. He says that we are disciples of God, branches of God, friends of God, chosen by God, loved by God, and sent by God. The gospel writer Luke further says that we've been given authority by God, that we are known intimately by God, and that we are witnesses of his gospel, his good news. This, Jesus says, is who we are. This is our identity, our inheritance. This is who we are to be and become. But this still doesn't answer the question, right? How do we become people who look like Jesus? We have to go further, because if all we do is focus on the truth of Jesus, well, that might make us feel good, but it won't inherently change our behavior. The other day, I was watching a documentary called You Are What You Eat. And the premise was to expose the industrialized food industry and to call the audience back to a healthier way of eating. And listen, the documentary shared a lot of truth, but I can hear that truth and still not change my diet. So if the truth of Jesus grounds us in reality, but doesn't alone produce the kind of inner transformation that we need in a distracted age, then perhaps we should look at the life of Jesus, the model for what a whole, undivided, attentive human being actually looks like. So let's do that. In all four Gospels, we see Jesus constantly retreat to what the Scriptures call the eremos. The eremos means the lonely place, the desolate place, or the desert. Here's a picture of sort of what this would look like. This was taken by someone on a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee a few years back. So not quite sand and smooth, think uncultivated and rough. But the Scriptures are clear. In this desolate place, Jesus regularly went to commune in solitude with God the Father. He spent much of his life in quiet. This is about the exact opposite of many of our day-to-day lives, right? Most of our lives are filled to the brim with noise. As soon as that alarm clock rings, we grab the phone, answer some text, check the emails we missed, and doom scroll on social media. And that's all just before getting out of bed. If you have kids, you're waking them up and getting them ready and out the door. Then comes a commute with a podcast or a Spotify constantly playing, the meetings stacked back to back throughout the day, the notifications pinging incessantly, the overstimulated drive home, leading to an evening spent half watching Netflix and half scrolling mindless cat videos. Listen, that's just my wife's day, by the way, not mine. From morning to evening, our lives are often over-inundated with noise. And in the rare moments they're not, we do whatever we can to avoid them. A recent survey from Microsoft found that 77% of young adults answered yes when asked this question: when nothing is occupying my attention, the first thing I do is reach for my phone. 77%. Listen, we like to assume that distraction wasn't an issue of the human heart in Jesus' day. We tend to read the Bible and assume that it would have been far easier in the first century to carve out this time of silence and solitude. But that was not the case. In the first century, people flocked to amphitheaters around the ancient Near East for theatrical performances, gladiatorial games, and chariot races. Urban markets created these environments of stressful stimulation as vendors, musicians, philosophers, and animals all vied for the attention of the visiting consumer. The distractions may change, but the human condition does not. There has always been resistance to this. And that's what makes Jesus' life so countercultural. Jesus may not have had screens everywhere primed to distract him, but he certainly had options. And yet it's clear that Jesus was the master of margin. Think about it. Jesus was a cultural icon. The Gospels are essentially a sprint through 3 years of constant activity. Jesus goes here, then there. Jesus does this, then this. Jesus heals this person, then that person. Jesus teaches to a crowd of 5,000, and then he goes and dines and communes with one person. On multiple occasions, people are literally chasing Jesus. My favorite is in Mark chapter 1, in verse 36, we read this. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Jesus, everyone is looking for you." And how does Jesus respond? "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." Do you see it? The clarity that's developed in the wilderness. Clarity in calling after spending time alone in the desert. Clarity in priority after withdrawing from large crowds. Jesus repeatedly and intentionally got away from the noise, the distraction, and the busyness of life simply to be with God, to recalibrate and reorient his life around the will of his Father. Look at what Jesus says in John chapter 6. "For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me." Can you guess what Jesus was doing right before he said that? Here's John chapter 6, verse 15. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Needless to say, Jesus was popular. He was busy. His schedule was full, and yet he fulfilled his mission in God's will unscathed. He lived a sinless life. This is really important. Jesus is both fully God and fully human. Therefore, he knows to the core of his soul what it feels like to be over-inundated, stressed, anxious, over-connected, fearful, insecure, and tired. And yet, Jesus was able to combat temptation to give into all of those feelings and more, to give into lust or unrighteous anger or unfaithfulness or comparison or envy or strife. And he did this by implementing rhythms of rest that produced recovery from the hits he took in the hard knocks of life. That's beautiful, isn't it? But still, we're not exactly there when it comes to answering our question, remember? How do we become like Jesus? That's what we're after, not mere information or inspiration. We're after heart transformation. We are after spiritual maturity. We are after becoming people of love, experiencing union with God. But to get there, we're going to have to accept the invitation that Jesus constantly has on offer, and that is to follow him, to put into practice the very truth he preached and the very life he modeled. Wait a second, Micah, isn't this just like legalism? Are you just going to put a ton of rules and restrictions around my devices in the name of following Jesus? Is that really where we're going? Short answer, no. Of course not. What we lack in our cultural moment isn't information or knowledge. We have more access to all of that than ever before. What we lack and what we're after here today is wisdom. We, as my friend Jay Kim so beautifully says, quote, want to both resist the temptation to rely on information as the primary mechanism for change and reimagine our church as a collaborative space where we can pursue and practice wisdom together. Listen, we hold a core conviction as a church that we are all becoming someone. Whether you are a follower of Jesus here or not, you are becoming like what you worship. Everyone is worshiping something. Everyone believes in a gospel. Therefore, what you worship will shape who you become. Or, to put it another way, what we give our lives to, we become defined by. And you can easily identify what you're giving your life to by studying where you're spending your time. What Jesus constantly puts before us is a way of life where our attention, our affection, and our devotion is primarily pledged, primarily committed to him. Everything we do is to flow out of responsive obedience to Jesus as Lord. You know, followers who said yes to this before they were known as Christians were known as followers of the way. Why? Because there is a way of life that Jesus invites us into. Listen to how pastor and author Eugene Peterson brilliantly put this. He says, quote, Jesus as the truth gets far more attention than Jesus as the way. Jesus as the way is the most frequently evaded metaphor among the Christians with whom I have worked for 50 years as a North American pastor. We cannot skip the way of Jesus in our hurry to get to the truth of Jesus as he is worshiped and proclaimed. The way of Jesus is the way that we practice and come to understand the truth of Jesus, living Jesus in our homes and our workplaces, with our friends and our families. Again, we see this all throughout the scriptures, don't we? In Matthew, Jesus finishes his famed Sermon on the Mount, not with a bunch of cliches or platitudes or lofty ideals. He finishes it with an invitation to put into practice the words he's been speaking throughout the entire sermon. In John's account, he says, if you love me, keep my commands, and that anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words you hear are not my own. They belong to the Father who sent me. In Luke, Jesus says, blessed are those who hear the word of God and obey it. On and on we could go, but the point remains. When our allegiance is to Jesus as King, that reality shapes everything else, including how we interact with the technology around us. This is how we change. This is how we mature. This is how we become like Jesus. We practice his way, we participate in his community, and we permeate his world. Practically speaking, then, the practice of Jesus that aids us in cultivating margins in our lives is the practice of solitude. Now, just to clarify, solitude is not the same thing as isolation. Solitude leads to greater engagement with creation or the Creator. Isolation is an escape from creation or the Creator. Solitude leads us into safety. Isolation leads us into danger. Solitude is how we open ourselves up to God. Isolation is how we corner ourselves into sin. Jesus teaches us that when we're stressed out, solitude is the answer. Jesus shows us that when we're forced to make difficult decisions, the way is not to distract ourselves or retreat into our devices, but to come before God our Father in silence and solitude. If you find yourself here today in a spiral of pain, hurt, or grief, escapism through digital busyness and activity is not the answer. Solitude and communion with the Father is. We could keep going, but the life of Jesus paints this clear picture that in order to maintain the integrity and health of our soul, heart, mind, body, and spirit, margin must be implemented, which is attained through the practice of solitude, of stillness, and of slowness. Every difficult or overwhelming situation that Jesus faces, he combats it with solitude. In a world that seeks to constantly destroy our self-worth, our identity, and our hope through a plethora of marketing schemes, advertisements, enticements, and treasures, Jesus shows us that the reprieve that we're looking for, the margin we seek, lies in the discipline and practice of solitude. This is the way of life that he invites us into, family. Now, before we continue, I want to note that what I'm going to offer here over the next few minutes is more pastoral counsel than biblical command. I very rarely do this. I always want our application to be anchored in God's word. But the reality is, as I mentioned above, Jesus and the writers of the scriptures did not live in a digital technological age like we do. And so we can certainly pull principles, but we cannot pull direct practices. And that leaves us in a bit of a bind when it comes to questions like, what would Jesus ask my relationship with TikTok to look like, right? So I want to humbly attempt to step into that gap for us today because I think this is that important. I see all of what I'm about to share as wisdom for following Jesus more faithfully in the digital age, not legalistic requirements or rules that you have to do because the Bible says so. And I could be wrong. I just want to make sure I'm clear about that on the front end. So while there's no specific practice of Jesus that speaks explicitly to our relationship with our phones, our streaming services, or our screens, I do believe that the truth, the life, and the way of Jesus gives us guardrails for how we are to live in the digital age and to become people of faith, hope, and love in a world that would love to drown us in loads of distraction couched in anger, lust, violence, envy, or even just plain stupidity. I call this living in digital margin. What is digital margin? It's quite simple. Digital margin is the intentional practice of routine technological disconnection. Digital margin is the intentional practice of routine technological disconnection. It's the intentional use of systems and practices that not only guard us from the unhealthy places our screens can take us, but also guide us more faithfully into the way of Jesus. That's our goal and what we are attempting to cultivate through this practice. Now, this idea is not new, and I did not invent it. It is just my best attempt to take the biblical wisdom that we're offered and to integrate that into our relationship with modern-day technology. So, what does it mean to live in digital margin? Well, first, I think it starts with a critical curiosity around how technology is shaping and forming us. Everyone seeking to live in digital margin should begin by asking these three questions of any and every device that we interact with. Number one, does this technology directly support something I deeply value? Meaning, is its purpose practical or purposeful? Is it aligned with the kind of life that I'm intentionally trying to build? Does it help me to prioritize what or who I say is most important in my life? God, my spouse, my parents, my kids, my best friend? Or is it distracting me and taking me away from those things? Number two, what is this technology doing to me when I'm not paying attention? In other words, are there passive ways this technology is shaping me when I'm not actively engaged with it? For example, during the last presidential election back in 2024, I would have cable news going on my TV in the background while I intently read long-form articles on my iPad. And I noticed over time that I was becoming more anxious and stressed out because although I was reading this thoughtful commentary that was full of nuance and depth, the headlines that I was hearing in the background were full of fear-mongering and existential angst, and it became overwhelming. And so one of the ways that I try to guard against that now is by limiting myself to interacting with only one screen at a time. And third, does this technology help me to become the kind of person Jesus desires for me to be? Am I growing in the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, and self-control? Or is this technology eroding those things in my life? Start here. And as you ask these questions, you can begin to build a sort of framework or a simple, intentional group of practices that guide your life through the lens of what you value most deeply. So here's mine. I've decided that I will have an iPhone rather than an alternative device because of my work requirements, but I keep a minimal number of apps on my iPhone. The iPhone is a tool to enhance my life, not the primary source of gratification or entertainment in my life. I intentionally find ways to keep my phone out of arm's reach, and I refuse to make it something that is constantly tethered to my person. This makes me a notoriously bad texter and an even worse email respondent, but the trade-off is worth it to me. 1 hour each day, 1 day each week, and 1 week each year, I spend device-free, and it is glorious. I look forward to that time all the time. This reminds me that I am in charge of my screens, not the other way around. Now, those are just a few of the 12 guidelines that I have for how I interact with technology. Now, 12 is not the magic number. It's just the number of convictions that I have around how I engage in the digital age at this time. Now, let's say you're having a really tough time with this. Maybe your addiction to screens is so ingrained, and you don't even realize how tethered you are to it until you try to stop being tethered to it. Or maybe your area of work or vocation requires you to be on your phone and available during set periods of time. Maybe you're feeling overwhelmed or burdened by the number of things you could do or should do in this area. And if that is you today, know that I get it. I've been there. And so instead of continuing down the rabbit hole and risking potentially losing you today, I'm going to stop there. But I do want to let you know that I've put together a very short little guide that's now available at sanctuaryindy.com/spiritual-practice. And in this guide, I've curated the best of what I've taken in over the last 7 to 8 years, articles, books, and ideas for how you can begin implementing the practice of living in digital margin in your life. This week in our sanctuary circles, we'll be engaging in the biblical practice of solitude and reviewing the guide, asking the Holy Spirit to reveal to us what invitations we might be sensing with respect to our relationship to our devices. So, more on that to come. The spiritual writer Henry Nouwen once said that solitude is not a private therapeutic place. It is the place of encounter. In Luke 22, Jesus has reached the eve of his crucifixion, and we read this beginning in verse 39. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. What a beautiful picture, isn't that? Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives. This was a regular place of prayer for Jesus. And this time his disciples followed him. They were slowly beginning to understand where he goes, we follow. Verse 40, on reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. This, my friends, is the place of encounter. Jesus is modeling for us here what it looks like to come before God in vulnerability and honesty. This is a moment of intense wrestling. Again, I think we often believe that practicing silence and solitude means always getting into this calm, serene state. And that absolutely can be a part of this practice. We call that contemplation, and that's great. But we need people who are also willing and ready to recover the practice of contending in the quiet place. People who are willing to step away from their screens and to wrestle and struggle and navigate the tensions and troubles of this complex life in an effort to be obedient to God the Father's will. Silence and solitude is the place of encounter. It is the place where we are reoriented to love what God loves and to want what God wants, if we allow Him the space to show us. Now, listen, I'll admit it, all of this might seem a bit intense, but I've been living into these rhythms for, 5+ years now, and I really don't feel like I've missed that much. And really, what's the cost? Missing out on Netflix while driving? Doom scrolling TikTok for hours on end? Maybe a loss of income or influence or public notoriety? Listen, there legitimately may be a cost. I'm not trying to diminish that. But as Jesus himself said, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? My point is, living in digital margin actually doesn't ask you to do more. It compellingly invites you to do less. But, and this is crucial, the invitation to do less does come at a cost. There is a radical minimum standard for following Jesus, and that is, as Jesus says in Matthew 16, denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following Him. Losing our lives in order that we might find and discover life, and life to the full. Listen, Jesus is not looking to be added into your life. He's looking to take over your life. Only you and the Lord will know what this looks like for you personally and what the specific invitation is. But I implore all of us to consider, to strongly consider how we are relating to technology today. Are you using it, or is it using you? And if you find yourself in that latter camp today, no shame. Remember, this is, as always, an invitation to a journey. And thanks be to God, we have been given the Spirit of God who resides in each of us day after day to will the one thing. My friends, everything that's been offered here today are simply means to an end. If we're just creating space just to fill it with more distraction, more slop, more escape, then we are missing it. The end goal, just so we're clear, is a union with God, to make room for Him and to make room to be with Him. I'm out of time, so let me close with this. The Apostle Paul writes, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." Of all the character traits listed here, self-control is consistently rated as one of the least practiced. People universally feel really bad about their capacity for self-control. And at the end of the day, that's what this conversation is about. Practicing self-control. Now, you might be thinking, so you want us to develop the one character trait that is consistently rated as the least developed character trait among people worldwide? Yes. Listen, there may be many habits in your relationship with technology that you want to change. You may be far more inundated with technology than you realized, and right now you're feeling overwhelmed or exhausted or discouraged. But remember, we are after discovering the more of less. So start where you are, not where you think you ought to be. Don't try to do too much. Simply begin. What is one thing that you can begin today? You know, there's one act of the will that does not deplete our capacity for self-control, but actually strengthens it. You know what it is? Surrender. Surrender. You can do that right now. In fact, if you're able and willing, let's just take a moment to close our eyes. Maybe place your hands, palms open in your lap, just like in a physical posture of surrender. Just become attuned and attentive to this moment here and now. Present to your body, present to the feelings that you're feeling in your body, whether it's anxiety or fear or restlessness or shame. Just imagine placing those feelings in your hands right now. Doubt or worry, confusion. And in this space, I want you to just say these words silently or out loud to yourself. God, your will be done. I want your will for my life, Jesus. Not the algorithms, not my work emails, not Netflix's, not FanDuel's. I want your will for my life, King Jesus. Or as Pastor John Ortberg so beautifully says, I can't. God, you can. I think I'll let you. Where might you need to let God in today? You can open your eyes. Remember that this is an invitation into a freer and lighter way of life. Jesus tells us, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. This is what's on offer today, family. An opportunity to learn the unforced rhythms of grace in a world that is constantly seeking to push you into forced rhythms of exhaustion, anxiety, and compulsive consumption. See, oftentimes we press into our devices in an attempt to be known and seen by the masses while ignoring the only one who can see and know us fully. We are overly visible to everyone else and yet feel invisible to the God of the universe. And in our futile efforts, we become exhausted, irritated, and burnt out, trying to keep up the persona and weighty expectations of everyone around us. Does this sound familiar for anyone? I'm speaking from personal experience. Listen, I don't want to pretend like I've got it all figured out. I'd be lying if I said I'd never struggled with any of those feelings to some degree when using my devices, or that I'm perfect in my relationship to technology. There are seasons where I have to detach entirely from my devices just to ensure that I'm not idolizing my online appearance over godly allegiance. It's hard, but it can be done. And the life of Jesus shows us how. Jesus slept. He withdrew. He said no. He let people down. He didn't heal everyone. He didn't respond to every need. He lived freely within the constraints of a fully human life because he trusted his Father enough to not be everywhere, to do everything, or to please everyone. Church family, if the Savior of the world lived that way, then surely we can too. His life shows us that margin, especially digital margin, isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Digital margin, simplicity with our screens, affords us the space for communion, for presence, and for peace. It affords us the space to hear the truth of Jesus, to study the life of Jesus, and to practice the way of Jesus in order to become like him. It affords us the space to experience deep down in our bones what we are almost deeply desiring, union with God, becoming people of love. And it's hard, but it can be done. And it starts today, one boundary, 1 minute of solitude, and one uninterrupted moment away from a screen at a time.